Joining us now to reflect on the 2023 F1 season is vlogger with Motozar TV, Lufefe Mayekiso. Fef, appreciate your time on Newzroom Afrika this evening. For starters, 9th race into the 2023 season. What has been the highlight of this year for you?
Well, the dominance of Red Bull is the first thing that comes to mind. They have a huge advantage over the other teams. Although we've seen in the last couple of races, Mercedes and Aston Martin seeming to close the gap, but still haven't done enough to challenge the Blue Bulls.
Talking about Red Bull, I mean, they continued that dominance today with a 1-2 finish at the Austrian Grand Prix in the sprint. There seems to be no stopping Max Verstappen and the team.
Yeah, it doesn't look like this season anyone has anything in the tank to catch up to Max Verstappen in particular. He's driving really imperiously, and one has to say his third championship is loading.
One then asks the question, what has been done right by Red Bull in the garage to make sure that, especially the past two seasons, have been a success for one, Verstappen, and we're also seeing his teammate, Sergio Perez, in close range?
Well, if you look back at the history of Red Bull, they used to use the Renault engine traditionally since they came into F1. But they switched to the Honda engine, I think, in 2017, where they put it in their junior team, AlphaTauri, to test it, because the Honda engine was previously in the McLaren and was braking 80% of the time. So they ironed out the gremlins in the junior team in AlphaTauri, and then they put it in the senior team, and we've just seen forward momentum ever since. So it is a long-term strategy that they're now bearing fruits of.
One of the things that we see in a sport like Formula One is the pairing that at the beginning of the seasons, the teams will try and put together. In this case, Max Verstappen has got a teammate in Sergio Perez. Is this the perfect pairing in the standards of F1?
You know, their relationship has become a little bit iffy lately, you know. And I don't think that the Red Bull team want that. I think traditionally, ideally for them, they want a number 1 and number 2 driver who will support the number 1. So Sergio's job, as much as maybe he hasn't been told outright, is to support Max Verstappen from what I see. So... But now Sergio has struggled in the last 3 or 4 Grand Prix and is actually coming under fire from Helmut Marko to say maybe his job is on the line. And we do know that Daniel Ricciardo, a former Red Bull driver, is currently the reserve driver waiting in the wings to take his place. And Red Bull have been known to be ruthless where they replace drivers even during the course of the season.
We've seen this turn in the tide then. With Red Bull then taking this dominance, Verstappen past 2 seasons, having successful runs. I mean, turning the tide in the sense that before this you would have a Ferrari, you would have a Mercedes as well in. Where is Ferrari in this case? I know Charles Leclerc, especially when it comes to the Austrian Grand Prix, if I remember correctly, he was the one that won this race last year.
100%. He did win the race last year. But this year, Ferrari, I think, have struggled more than they did last year. Because last year, they were the contenders against Red Bull for about 60% of the season, before Max ran away with it after the summer break. But this year, they've been on the back foot. However, they've brought upgrades to this venue, which has seen Charles Leclerc take the front row next to Max Verstappen, just 600ths of a second behind. So we don't know if that's the one-lap pace, or if they've got, you know, pure performance over a race distance.
I spoke to you about this in the watch-along earlier in the season, when the season started. One of the questions that I asked was about the surprise package in Fernando Alonso and Aston Martin. How happy have you seen them, or have you seen this team this season? How surprised, if it's a surprise, how surprising has it been for Aston Martin to be doing so well? And we know the experience of Fernando Alonso in himself, but how surprising has it been to see the experience, see the team doing so well this season?
They have to be the surprise of the season, you know. I mean, Aston Martin finished 7th in the Constructors last season, so they were nowhere. Even when Alonso announced that he'd be leaving Alpine for Aston Martin, it was like it raised a few eyebrows. Is he sure? Because Alpine finished 4th in the Constructors last season. But it turned out to be a stroke of genius, And at the beginning of the year, we thought maybe they'd fade away as the season progressed. But they've been right up there, although this weekend they look to be behind Mercedes and Ferrari in terms of performance. But they have sustained it over the last 9 Grand Prix, which has been very impressive. And they also announced that they're going to be switching to Honda in 2026, which is the engine on the Red Bull currently, because Red Bull has got their factory in Milton Keynes, Red Bull Powertrains, where they'll be merging with Ford to build their own engines, because they're tired of the customer situation, the dynamic that comes with it, etc., and the politics.
They're sitting third in the constructor standings this time, just behind Mercedes, but in front of Ferrari. What has been the key in their success as a team in Aston Martin this season?
Well, I think other than performance, they've also had good reliability. So they've finished both cars in the points in a lot of the races, I think 6 or 7 this season. Lance Stroll, though he's not been performing as well as Fernando Alonso, I think in the last race in Canada, which was his home Grand Prix, was the first time that he's finished ahead of Alonso this season. And even today, you saw in the sprint race, he finished ahead of him. And even in the race tomorrow, he's not far behind. So I think maybe he's starting to adapt to the setup of the car and learning from the 2-time world champion on the other side of the garage, which is helping the team move forward in its entirety.
As somebody who's been following the sport and looking very closely, especially with each and every garage, what has Mercedes not done right this season? Have they not constructed a competitive car once again? What have they solely not done right once again this season?
Well, I think Mercedes, their problems is just a hangover of last year, you know. So they're still playing catch-up after they were caught by surprise with the new regulations last season, where we saw their car porpoising more than the others. Yes, we did see porpoising like in teams like Ferrari, but if you saw the Ferrari last year, it was porpoising, but it was still very fast, and immediately they disengaged the accelerator. It would settle, which would mean that it would corner much better than the Mercedes. But the Mercedes, it would be like you're driving in gravel. At some point, even Lewis was complaining that he needed massages from his former physio, what was her name now? The Allen lady, but yeah. So I think that now Mercedes, they came with the philosophy of saying they're not going to put side pods, but the upgrade that they brought, which was supposed to come at the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix, but they only introduced in Monaco, where we didn't really see its performance, but we only saw it in Spain, where we saw them at least bridge the gap to Aston and to Red Bull. So they're finding their feet, because they didn't know fundamentally when you asked them what was wrong with the car. I think it was too low last year, and with the bigger tires, the 18 inches and everything, it sort of impacted them more than the others. So they're still learning the philosophy, the characteristics of the car, while trying to extract maximum performance.
Followers of Mercedes wake up every single morning, go on Instagram, click refresh to try to see whether Lewis Hamilton or the contract talks with him have been finalized. Give us an update in terms of what's happening at Mercedes when it comes to Lewis Hamilton's contract talks. Are they coming together with Toto Wolff, having a mean conversation to say probably he's staying in the team?
Seemingly, these negotiations are quite difficult, because they did say that the matter would be concluded by the time we got to the Spanish Grand Prix. That was 3 races ago now, if you include this race weekend. And still, we've heard nothing. And of course, before that, we heard that Ferrari had approached Lewis Hamilton to say maybe he can replace one of the drivers next season. So, for me, I think that maybe he had talks with Ferrari. They said they're prepared to pay an amount etile, and then now he's using that as a bargaining chip for his negotiations with Mercedes. That's what I think. And that's the sticking point, because currently Max Verstappen's contract is higher than his. And that can't sit well with him. And even Helmut Marko alluded to that, that Lewis is not happy that he's not the highest paid driver, being the most successful driver on the grid and in the history of F1. So I'm sure he's saying, I want maybe a £50 million per season, And maybe Toto is not so open to that at the moment.
I can tell you in football that whenever there's situations like this where a player still having these negotiations, it has those little effects in terms of how he plays in the game. Could that be the situation with Mercedes right now, or how you've reviewed the sport over the years? Does it even have an effect? I know Lewis Hamilton is a very, very professional driver, but does it have the slightest of effects when it comes to performance in terms of this contract talks or nothing being finalized?
No, these guys are professional. They do these discussions and have been doing them for years. So no matter what the situation is with the contract talks, I don't think that it's going to impact the relationship between the mechanics and the engineers and the drivers and even the team principals. For me, I think they'll keep it professional, even if, say, they are parting ways at the end of the season. But what they would do is then obviously try not to reveal too much about next season's car, if, say, Lewis would be joining a Ferrari next season.
Front of the great Max Verstappen, is he going to have any challenge at the Austrian Grand Prix? It's a home Grand Prix that gives it the most motivation for any driver.
Well, if he had a 21-second gap in the sprint race today, I don't see anyone challenging him. And today it was changing conditions. There was a bit of rain in the beginning, then people had to switch to dry tires, but he stayed on the intermediates and still managed to maintain that gap, despite being 4 seconds a lap slower than the dry tire drivers. So I don't see anyone challenging him. Unfortunately for Perez, his lap was deleted in Q2, his fastest lap, where he would have been starting alongside Max Verstappen, but now he's behind. But in this track, there are 3 DRS zones, so you can overtake. It's a short lap, so maybe we could see a Red Bull 1-2 finish at the Red Bull Ring.
Fifth, before I let you go, despite the talks of having a Grand Prix coming to South Africa in the future, dimming by every single year, but there's still Formula One lovers in the country that every single Sunday they sit in front of a screen and watch. You provide that platform every single Sunday. Let us know about tomorrow, where people can come and watch the Grand Prix, I guess, for the rest of the season as well.
Okay, yes. We host F1 watch-alongs, which we live stream on our YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch channels. So what a watch-along is you watch us watching the race. It's basically a visual representation of commentary. So we do that at Vernacular Lounge, which is at Ilovo Junction on number 1 Corlet Drive. Every race day, if we're not going to be there, because sometimes we do experiences outside of the venue, we'll obviously notify you on our socials, but most of the races, that's where you're going to find us. Vernacular Lounge, 1 Corlet Drive, Ilovo.
Lufefe, appreciate your time on Newzroom Africa this season. We'll catch up with you soon.
Thank you for having me.
F1 vlogger with Motors RTV, Lufefe Mayekiso, just giving us a reflection of the F1 season. We're seeing with the Austrian Grand Prix this weekend, Max Verstappen leading that pack and continuing the dominance.